Okay, so we will straight away start with the next session, and I can see Dr. Nangia has joined in, and I'll also request other people to become visible. Dr. Parul is visible now.
Good evening, sir. Good
Good
evening.
evening. Good evening, Dr. Parul.
Good evening, everybody.
All right, so we are into the session 3, glaucoma session, and Dr. Parul, I'll hand over to you uh, for conducting the rest of the program.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Good evening, everybody. And I welcome you all to the 33rd POS annual conference and the first glaucoma session of the conference. We have very esteemed speakers who would be enlightening us about what's happening new in this field. And I would like to invite, first and foremost, Professor Sushmita Kaushik, who needs no introduction, and she would be talking to us about recent advances in glaucoma management. Professor Sushmita Kaushik is an expert in the field of imaging in childhood glaucomas and is practicing currently in the Advanced Eye Center at PGI Chandigarh. So over to you, Sushmita ma'am, for the talk.
Thank you very much, Dr. Parul, Dr. Pandav sir. I'll just share my screens and thank you, COS, for the opportunity. I hope it's visible now.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, okay. So, good afternoon. And while the Olympics are on, course is on as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is new and what is on the horizon for glaucoma. So we look at challenges and what is the need to really look beyond current treatment modalities, what has been tried and what is feasible to us in the current framework. So the options for treatment are really medication, lasers and surgery, and each modality has its own set of challenges. Now the problems with medication is of course the cost and availability, the compliance, sometimes it gets to be refractory to treatment, and then of course there are allergies and side effects. So these are just a few examples of side effects of preservatives, of which benzalkonium chloride causes dose-dependent toxic effects on the ocular surface. And then there are side effects of the anti-glaucoma drugs itself, with brimonidine, with skin pigmentation, and bimatoprost here shows the lash enlargement. So I'd just like to touch upon the new class of drugs which are now available. One is the Rho kinase inhibitor, the ROCK inhibitor, the Netasodil and Ripasodil. And Ripatech is available in India, and recently we've had Netasodil also being available. And these are enzymes that control cell shape and movement, and ROCK inhibitors lower IOP by relaxing the trabecular meshwork and increasing conventional outflow. So though not in the Indian market, maybe it's soon to come. In the pipeline is Vyzulta, which is latanoprostene bunod, and Rocklatan, which is latanoprostene bunod and latanoprost. So the three identified IOP lowering mechanisms, it's almost too good to be true. They reduce aqueous production, they increase the conventional outflow, they increase the uveoscleral outflow, and apparently also have neuroprotective activity. But we need to have a little more experience before we know that. So I just like to share a limited initial experience. This 10-year-old boy with the one-eyed left eye lost to retinal detachment referred to us with late onset PCG and good vision. 2 surgeries, didn't do too well, failed okay for 3 years, came back to us with 28 pressures. We did a limited DLCP. So you can already see without medication and with the ocular medication started a little bit of redness, but still 21 on 3 topicals. And when we started Netasodil, 12 millimeters in about 4 to 6 weeks, but then the significant hyperemia, and this can be very, very troublesome, especially in uniocular patients. So lasers, in a nutshell, you have the LPI, we have trabeculoplasty, and we have cyclophotocoagulation. And the new kid on the block here is really the micropulse transscleral photocoagulation. But then I'd like to just touch upon SLT because this is a laser which is taken up selectively. It's been around for quite a while now, but somehow not in our usual armamentarium. So this is a video showing it's an easy thing to do really, a large spot size. And these are the champagne bubbles, which you can see, which shows the accurate placement of the laser and the effectivity. So it's a good thing to do for ocular hypertensives and treatment naive POAG. And even in half to 2/3 are off drugs for a while, it would be quite useful. Coming to cyclophotocoagulation, we all know about diode. Nowadays, we try to do trans-illumination, which helps in delineating the ciliary body. It's been described for children, but now we see that it's even important in adults. So again, sharing a case makes it always a little more interesting. So this is post-DLCP hypotony, which we're all so scared of, that it might go into phthisis, which makes us hesitate to use it in seeing eyes. But if you can see this hypotony, and when we did the UBM, we saw the supraciliary fluid. And then we really wondered what we had done. And then when we did UBM throughout, you can see the cavitation in the ciliary body. And this is really the damage that is done with the DLCP. So it's important that the minute you hear a pop, and this is what a pop does, that you reduce it by about 250 milliwatts so that you're sure that you're not popping the ciliary body, as it were. So I just thought I'd share this. A micropulse CPC, the mechanism of action is similar to that of pilocarpine because it acts on the longitudinal fibers of the ciliary muscle, increases outflow, and apparently there's no ciliary body destruction, and similar IOP lowering reportedly with lesser complications. We did have a demo machine in which we weren't very, very happy with the results. We didn't find the pressure lowering as much as DLCP, but we need to maybe work on it a little more. But it's important to know that it's available. The other cyclophotocoagulation is ECP, or endocyclophotocoagulation. This is a controlled ablation of ciliary processes by direct endoscopic visualization. It's more predictable, obviously, because you can see the ciliary process here, which you're coagulating, especially in eyes which the anatomy is grossly distorted. So this one probe has a light, it has aiming beam as well as diode laser, and it's available in both the 20 gauge and 23 gauge designs. And you can use it from the anterior or from the pars plana approach. So this has a lot of promise in eyes which are difficult to do otherwise. Coming to surgery, we all know that though trabeculectomy is the gold standard, there are a few problems with these. We don't want to land up. So in case we can and go on to avoiding the conjunctiva, that's what minimally invasive surgery is all about. It's minimal disruption of conjunctiva, sclera, and iris, mostly angle-based. They bypass the abnormal trabecular meshwork. And then you have translimbal surgeries, which bypass the normal outflow completely, but do form a conjunctival blip. However, none of these precludes further surgery. So remember that you might require surgery later. So the angle-based ones which we have are goniotomy, which we can do, a goniotomy-assisted translimbal trabeculotomy, and a trabectome. That's available in India. But then what has been described is also a TRAB 360, iStent, Hydrus, and the Cahoog dual blade. Hopefully the Cahoog dual blade will be soon available. Translimbally, the Zen implant is the most common one. And now we also have the PRESERFLO microshunt. So the prerequisites for MIGS, of course, is direct gonioscopy. So we are happy that gonioscopy should take on if MIGS has to take on. Just a quick thing that the head has to be tilted. The surgeon sits directly opposite the angle to be operated. So this is just a few short clips of how the microscope has to be tilted so that the light goes straight into the angle. And while putting a direct gonioscope, this is in a small child where we were preparing a direct gonioscopy, and the head is tilted like that and the gonioscope comes in. So this is a short clip of a goniotomy. You treat as much of the angle as is possible. Most of MIGS are on this principle. So you can see the angle fall back. This is of course in a child, but in an adult, you can use a trabectome or a dual blade to do the same thing. So here you can see the treated angle, which has fallen back. Trabectome, as we said, have the same principles. We are happy to have acquired it last year and have done a reasonable number of cases. It uses plasma energy to ablate the trabecular meshwork. So the advantage in adults is that it's not just a small incision, but it goes a little further. So it's a fairly simple procedure. Once you go in, similar to a goniotomy, this is the plasma, this is the knife which delivers plasma energy to it. And once you engage in the trabecular meshwork, And in a minute, in a few seconds, you'll just see the energy being delivered. So you just go there. They advise you not to use viscoelastic. So it does have irrigation ports on either two sides. So this is under continuous irrigation. And here you see once it engages, and then you just press the foot pedal, and this is the plasma energy. So you can see the trabecular meshwork just ablated completely, and there's no trabecular meshwork there. So we found it very useful in patients who have early or mild glaucomas with cataracts, and that's where we combine it most commonly. So just a bit about minimally invasive failed trabeculectomy blebs. We've started using an ab interno bleb revision, Grover-Feldman spatula, again sparing conjunctiva. So minimally invasive is all about sparing conjunctiva. You just put in a bit of pilocarpine. I'll just fast forward this. So under a direct gonioscope, you need to see the fistula, and once this goes in, and then you remove the gonioscope, look through the microscope, and soon you'll see in a minute. It's just like needling, except that you're going ab interno, so you're not disrupting conjunctiva again, and that makes it a little better. So here you are, you just slowly go under the scleral flap until you come out into the subconjunctival space, and there you can see the blue tip of this spatula coming out in the subconjunctival space. And we are happy with doing this now. A lot of patients requiring a full bleb revision. Now we go the ab interno route, and it's far less invasive than it was. So this is an example of a completely scarred bleb. You need a patent scleroscopy, and 2 months later, you have a diffuse bleb with fluid in. So to summarize, the goals of newer management really is to bypass patient factors of adherence and compliance and minimize toxicity. And the second thing is enhance surgical success by limiting fibrosis and minimizing complications. So let's look at the possibilities and start work on them. Thank you so much for this invitation again. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. It was really very well encompassing both all the medical laser as well as the surgical advancements. There's one question for you from Dr. Ravinder, and he asks that how often can SLT be done, and can it be repeated in 6 months?
Well, usually the SLT, when it came, it was told that you do 180 degrees. So then obviously you had the other angle to repeat. But with the 360 degree being done at one go, the need for repetition is lesser. But yes, since you're not confluently lasering the whole thing, there would be trabecular meshwork which is untreated. So yes, it can be repeated. But of course, more than 1 or 2 repeatings will only result in scarring a little bit. And I don't think it will work beyond that.
Have you repeated any within 6 months of doing the procedure, ma'am?
We've repeated, yes. When it doesn't work, I have repeated, but then usually the repeats don't work either. So somehow we think that it's refractory, and then we switch them all to treatment or medical treatment.
Right.
Dr. Parul is, I think she's a consultant professor now at Government Medical College, Chandigarh, and she's alumni of PGI. And she's a very academically oriented, prolific writer, and has been, has authored already many books, and she also in the academic committee of the World Glaucoma Congress. Dr. Parul will be talking about artificial intelligence and glaucoma. Again, a very interesting topic. So over to you, Dr. Parul.
Thank you, sir. I would be talking about artificial intelligence, and we all know that there has been a major transformative change in healthcare following the introduction of artificial intelligence, and ophthalmology has not remained untouched by its influence. And glaucoma has also benefited a lot from artificial intelligence. So before I go on to talk about AI, let's just get familiar with the common lingo of this AI. So the core of it is machine learning, in which the algorithm or the machine which is running the database learns by trial and error. Now, since there was a lot of elements that were not clear as how they were predicting the outcome, more and more techniques were evolved, and then we got neural networking, or which is also called as ANN or CNN, in which there are multiple neurons which are providing multiple inputs to arrive at an output. So since multiple inputs of a large database, that is the big data, are being analyzed, we get a better outcome. Going a step further is deep learning, wherein in addition to what we give an input, the algorithm also tries to come out with patterns which the human mind cannot comprehend on its own. So with those patterns, things like progression in glaucoma can be easily comprehended. The lower layers of the deep learning algorithm, they are like edges of the system, while the deeper layers, they give you information about various concepts which you can comprehend. A problem with machine learning was the black box phenomenon. So what is black box? That whatever information you are feeding, the computer algorithm is analyzing it and giving you an output whether your patient has glaucoma or not. But how it is coming at that conclusion is not known to the medical physician. So that is something which is not acceptable in all the cases. So to overcome the black box phenomenon, deep learning helped to have a concept of open AI or explainable AI by adding more and more elements to the algorithm that is being used to analyze the data. The segmentation of the data can now be understood by the doctor, and we can get to know how that program is coming at the conclusion whether your patient has or does not have glaucoma. So since glaucoma is not only undiagnosed, even when it is diagnosed, it is not treated well, as there are multiple elements that need to be considered for the correct diagnosis and treatment. So to put all these pieces together, along with the factor that the glaucoma outcome is variable and is influenced by different ethnicity and races, the AI comes handy for a disease like this. Two more concepts. We have something called a supervised AI, wherein when we are feeding in data to the system, that's fully labeled. So say, for example, I have about 100 optic discs. I label those optic discs as regards the neuroretinal rim, the amount of cupping they have, and then feed it into the system. This is called as the ground truth. And based upon this ground truth, the machine will give you an output whether this patient is referable glaucoma, whether he requires treatment, or how is he going to be prognostically in the coming few years. But a lot of times you need to know more about the progression, more about the pattern of damage that is happening, and that is done by unsupervised AI, wherein you don't label the data, but you feed in so much data that the machine can make a pattern or trajectory out of it. And then we have some hybrid models, including both supervised and unsupervised AI. Why this is important is that the newer OCT machines or the newer perimetry machines that are coming are using these technologies to give you an idea as to how your patient is going to behave. So AI is now being used for classification of glaucoma, which is entirely data driven, backed by data from lots and lots of centers. The data is pre-processed, the artifacts are removed, the contrast of the images is normalized, the vessels are impainted, the machine learning algorithm in the machine, it extracts the features and applies certain models using Python and R, which is the coding which is used in the machines, and gives you a diagnosis. It is also used for screening, and now it makes all the more sense with COVID coming in. A lot of patients cannot move to the main centers. So therefore, if a fundus camera has a screening algorithm, the referable glaucoma can be easily identified. Intraocular pressure trends have also contributed to the knowledge. So AI has been used for evaluation of data with the Sensimed Triggerfish contact lens system. And it has been found that combining data of the contact lens parameters and the baseline IOP can give you an indication of presence of open angle glaucoma and how the patient is likely to behave. Most commonly used AI is for analyzing the fundus photographs of the optic nerve head. The optic disc and optic cub segmentation is the most common technology, which is now being incorporated in the new fundus cameras that are coming up. And it uses two concepts. You can either have it based on the retinal clinical indicators like the cup disc ratio or the isn't rule, or some of the machines, they use image texture analysis techniques, wherein it looks for fundus features such as the window defects in the RNFL, and it tries to pick out a pattern whether the patient has or doesn't have glaucomatous damage. Multiple data sets have been used to train these machines. Some of the machines use local data sets and some use public domain data sets. Now, Google has been using data sets with lakhs and lakhs of images. They all have been contributed from different countries and therefore is a reliable pool of data. A new data set that has come up is Refuge. Why it is important for glaucoma is that it is trying to standardize a framework for the algorithms for optic disc and optic cup segmentation. So it is believed that the machine which is going to use the Refuge data set would have a much more uniform and standardized outcome for that. Visual fields can also be analyzed well by AI. We can identify pre-perimetric defects. Even data from FDT can be analyzed. And studies have shown that AI has the ability to differentiate between glaucomatous as well as non-glaucomatous visual field defects. This recent study based on deep learning has found that central visual field defect pattern can contribute a lot to the knowledge of the predictability of progression of glaucoma, in addition to the mean deviation, and the data contributed by this is way better than just the global indices. Visual field progression can also be figured out by the use of machine learning. CascadeNet 5 is a model which is a deep learning model which has been now lately being used by the newer visual field machines that are coming up. And in this, it has a unique feature that there is an ability to predict the future visual fields for up to 5.5 years based on just a single input visual field. So with just one field, we can predict whether in the coming 5 years, the patient is going to have the disease or not. Now we have a lot of parameters. We have clinical parameters, we have visual field images and OCT images. So the machine has to find out an image which will give the most accurate outcome. So that is called as feature engineering. Now with machine learning, feature engineering was manual, but with deep learning, it is automated. So it's much more easier now to comprehend OCT data. So machines now can do image processing, segment the data, segment the OCT image into several layers, demarcate the RP, and tell you how the optic nerve head on the OCT is going to behave. So now using that, the authors from the US, they have used quantitative spectral domain OCT data to train a deep learning algorithm to quantify the damage based on the optic disc photographs. So you get a deep learning predicted probability of whether this disc is glaucomatous or not. For anterior segment OCT, also screening for angle closure is possible using AI. The challenges of AI are that since we have anomalous disc, different cup to disc ratio, tilted disc and myopic disc, the outcomes can sometimes be difficult to interpret. We don't have a comprehensive platform as of now, which puts in data from OCT, visual field, and pachymetry and everything else together to give you an output. But we have comprehensive platforms which can talk about glaucoma, diabetic retinopathy, AMD, and cataract in one go. So future directions for involving AI include glaucoma drug discovery and involving multimodal analysis using different devices. So the key message is for better AI development, feed in good data and collaborate with bigger centers to club in data so the big data can contribute to a more relevant outcome. I would suggest people to try this Teachable Machine Google platform. You can feed in database from your system and get an idea about how the AI works. So you can have a mini AI of your own database that you have in the fundus machine. So with this, I would like to thank COS for giving me this opportunity. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Parul. I think this is one area which is a little difficult to comprehend. And I think for the uninitiated, it's really kind of a black box, you said in the in your presentation. So it's like a black box, but what comes out of the black box is actually sometimes very useful. So we are still trying to understand it, and I think things are going to get better with time. We'll take up the questions, I think, towards the end. We'll have some time. Is Dr. Vinay online? I don't think so.
No, sir, can't see.
So I think we can go to the next.
Haji.
So I'm doing the next one.
Yes. So I invite Professor S.S. Pandav, who is the head of the Department of Advanced Eye Center and currently the president of Glaucoma Society of India, to talk about personalizing glaucoma therapy. Over to you, sir.
Okay, I'll share the screen and okay. So, all right. So I think glaucoma therapy is a little complicated, and I don't have any personal financial disclosures. So we know there's a lot of glaucoma out there. As of now, probably close to 80 million people have it, as per projection, 75 to 80 million, and almost 500,000 blind people in both eyes blind because of glaucoma. And we know it affects people are about 45 years. So it's a significant health problem basically, and the goal of treatment to preserve vision for as long as we can, so that person has doesn't get into disability, visual disability during his lifetime. The problem with the glaucoma management is that there's no one management plan that fits all patients. Because glaucoma basically is a multifactorial disease. We don't really know what causes glaucoma. And so there's no one way to treat this condition. And also we know glaucoma leads to visual loss. So there's a threat to vision. And this level of threat actually varies in different individuals. So some people progress very fast. Some people progress very slowly. They will never go blind. And some people go blind within very short span of time. So each individual is different in that sense. So this best way is to know, identify some risk factors basically, which could lead to a different outcome in different individuals. So that I think is the key issue here. So that means that we need to do some kind of a glaucoma risk profiling for our patients. And some of the risk factors we already know: there's age, family history, myopia, thin cornea, and there could be some other systemic factors like you have, uveitis, trauma, previous surgery, steroid exposure, cardiovascular disease, and number of other factors. Actually, smoking can also be, contributing. So if we have, if we have some kind of an idea based on the number of risk factors and also the existing, damage, one could probably say that how much is the risk of going blind or losing vision or visual disability in a particular patient. So if the risk is low, moderate, or high, that can help us, decide how we want to deal with a particular patient. So glaucoma progression is what we worry about, and that's what poses a risk to treatment. And as I said, the age, family history, ocular biomechanics, existing damage. Now, one often argues that because these are the things we can't really do anything about because they are not modifiable factors. But even if they are not modifiable factors, they actually tell us a very important story about the patient. They tell us that how much damage has already happened, and they would tell us kind of they help us in establishing the status quo of the department, the current status of the disease. And from there, you can have some sort of projections that how this is likely to behave, or what difficulties we are likely to face in future. Like if the damage is already much advanced damage, then you've got to be very careful. If there's a family history of someone going blind, a close relative going blind because of glaucoma, then there's a high risk of, or the threat perception is higher, and especially if the IOP is high. So on the other side, there's a high IOP, which is a very well known risk factor for glaucoma, and the modifiable factor. So usually we kind of tend to think that high IOP is the only modifiable factors, but there are other factors also which can lead to poor compliance, or there could be treatment related, effective, non-effective, availability, not availability, and there could be other diseases as well as some lifetime situations which could be contributing towards glaucoma. and we need to assess them, and we need to be carefully look into it before we design a management strategy, the aim of which obviously is to reduce or eliminate the risk. It may not be possible to eliminate the risk all the time, but we can always reduce it. So that's where the personalization actually comes in. So basically what this means is that each individual, because the glaucoma the glaucoma management as a generalized form doesn't fit into, doesn't address all the concerns of the individual. So we must look at the individual factors which should be considered while designing a treatment plan, because there may be many individual things which are missed out if you are generalizing too much. And in glaucoma, a lot of things are kind of generalized. So for that, the detailed medical history is actually very important. You have to go into the medical history, which is often neglected. And we have to look at not only the medical part, but the social part, social history, as well as financial status of the patient, and even the social support of the patient would be required for managing this patient on a long-term basis. Now, if you have an electronic database and we can do data mining, or AI-based systems can be used to analyze the data which is available for a particular patient, and that can also actually guide us where if there are any particular traits in that patient which can be handled differently or more appropriately. But this field is still developing, and you had just heard about the AI in relation to the medical diagnosis, but AI also has other factors where this can actually look into your databases and also help you give you a little more focused or more precise treatment. So IOP lowering is the mainstay of treatment. We all know that, but the important thing here is that you must have a good baseline. So you will be surprised that most of the time we don't actually have a good baseline, because the decision to treat glaucoma or not to treat glaucoma is usually made with a very limited data set that we have, which actually means just a few IOP recordings over a period of time. Ideally, we should have multiple recordings over several days, and also preferably a diurnal variation to know what is the real baseline of the IOP is, and also if there are any fluctuation in 24 hours time, which are very common and often missed, and very often are the reason for progression of disease or occurrence of glaucoma in the first place. So a good baseline IOP is very, very important for every patient, and this is going to be different for each patient. So if you have this information, you could target your therapy more precisely to meet the IOP requirements. And second is that how much IOP loading is required for a particular patient, the magnitude of the treatment that you want to install. So for that, you have a target IOP concept, which is again a very well established concept. The only problem is that there's no one way or no a good way, I would say, perfect way, I would say, to determine target IOP. But whatever algorithm you use, whatever way you use, I think it's good to have a target in mind before you start treating these patients. And the target IOP again would be individualized. It will be different for different people, depending upon the existing damage, depending upon the status of the myopia, depending on this family history or the perceived risk of threat, and depending on the corneal thickness. So there are a number of factors again which have to, and its age, of course. So there are a number of factors that have to be considered before you start an IOP, and how much the glaucoma damage has already happened. So again, this has to be individualized, and based on that, then you will select the therapy for treatment. Another important thing which is known but is often missed is the systemic factors. So we know that hypertension or nocturnal hypertension is often associated, but the relationship between the hypertension and glaucoma is actually not very clearly defined. It does play some role, but what role is not very clearly defined. But we know that hypertension does have an association with glaucoma, and especially in nocturnal dip in blood pressure, because there's a time when IOP tends to be higher, and oxygen saturation tend to be perhaps on the lower side, and you have a blood pressure which is up. So all this kind of works as a recipe for glaucomatous damage. And it's said that if you 10% dip in systolic pressure at night, this is often associated with the higher risk of disc hemorrhage and perhaps deterioration in glaucoma. And we also have, many times we forget, is about the respiratory condition of the person, or the sleep apnea particularly, or obstructive sleep apnea. Now, patient won't complain of this because they actually don't know that they have it. Many times they don't know they have it. But you investigate all glaucoma patients, and you find the significant number of these patients, they would have some respiratory sleep apnea. Now, if that can be adequately treated, then some of the damage could be prevented in these patients. So again, you have to look at each individual. Then you also have a primary vascular dysregulation, especially noted with NT. So they are not obviously hypertensive or no cardiovascular problem, but they have a vascular, the spastic disorder of the vessels, or they have conditions like migraine, which is quite often associated with NTG as compared to healthy controls, and also some association with Alzheimer's disease or Flemmer syndrome. So these associations are well known, but what exactly the association, that's not very clear. But I think you will doing the latest technologies, the SPECT scan. SPECT is the single photon emission CT scan. So if you do it in NTG patients, it has been found that NTG patients show similar patterns like the patterns seen in Alzheimer's disease. So that means some people also like to think, and they have a point that NTG, or at least NTG, if not other varieties of glaucoma, they have some neurodegenerative component, and this which may be independent of intraocular pressure. So if you have that information in a given patient, then your focus would probably shift from IOP to other conditions. So you could treat that patient in a different manner. You also have ocular factors in many of these conditions, which are important when it comes to instituting therapy to these. Ocular surface diseases are quite often in this, and then may alter your decision to what medicine you want to give. Ocular allergies, inflammatory conditions, uveitis, or the surface inflammation, corneal diseases. So all these can impact the choice of your therapy. So each individual, I think you have to consider these factors and before you started therapy. So that's again is very important. And also you have to look at the applicability of the treatment. So if you have decided to choose a particular drug or a way of treating a patient, then you have to consider whether the patient is likely to, will be able to institute that therapy, will be able to take the therapy or not. So physical disabilities, arthritis, cervical spine, and other problems, rheumatoid arthritis, they are all well, mentioned in literature, well known. But sometimes, the patient just forget. So forgetfulness is quite common, actually. They may not have overt dementia or Alzheimer's, but they just forget. And in fact, one of the patients has a problem. What he says is that, I remember to use drugs. I do it every day, but what happens is that I forget that whether I use the drops in the morning or not. So, in the afternoon, he starts wondering whether he used the drops in the morning or not, and whether he reuse it or not again. So, forgetfulness is quite common, and sometimes people are not compliant just because they don't remember whether they use the morning drop or not. So I think that's the situation. Again, you have to look at that patient differently and maybe think of some alternative way of treating that patient. And also the economy is very important for us. The cost of drugs, it can easily multiply. And if the patient is on 2 or 3 drugs, you can easily spend 1,500 to 2,000 rupees every month. And it's a lifelong treatment burden, which everybody cannot really tolerate. So you have to adjust therapy according to the patient resources, which is again very important consideration, in tailoring the therapy. Then choice of drugs is again, normally, as of now, the choice of drug is basically a hit and trial method. So we have a kind of a algorithm or some understanding that we start with a particular drug and then go, next, depending on their efficacy and safety profile. But at best, it's a hit and a trial method, because you have to give the drug, then wait for the efficacy, wait for the side effect. It doesn't work, then you try something different, and the same cycle goes on. So for that reason, coming years might be, now we might have some pharmacogenetics coming into the picture, where now, the genome-wide association studies have shown done in many different ethnic groups. Increasing number of gene loci have been identified, which are possibly implicated in glaucoma. And similarly, there, the genetic information is being related to whether a particular drug is is likely to work or it's not likely to work. So the deeper insights into the pathophysiological and molecular mechanisms underlying glaucoma could lead to new set of therapies, and also which include gene therapy, and also understand better which drugs are likely to be useful in a given patient or not. So personalizing this treatment according to the genetic profile is also there in the future, but I think we still have to wait for that. But even if that is not there, we can do a lot to personalize glaucoma treatment, as I mentioned earlier, in a given situation. So glaucoma is a multifactorial disease. There are many phenotypes with different underlying mechanisms, so we need to understand them in a given patient and direct our therapy accordingly. And many factors are involved in the success or failure of the therapy. So we need to understand that as well. And glaucoma therapy needs to be tailored to the individual needs so that it is maximally benefit to that particular person. And also the better understanding about the disease process, newer modalities of treatment, and newer ways of treating are likely to help in future as well. So I think with this, I'll finish my talk, and we can take up any questions later. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you, Phanab. Glaucoma indeed is a puzzle, is a jigsaw puzzle with many, many pieces. And we need to put everything in perspective. Yes. I now invite Professor Vinay Nangia for his talk on importance of compliance in glaucoma therapy. Dr. Nangia is the director at Suraj Eye Institute, Nagpur, and he has been the past president of Glaucoma Society of India, and also has been the principal investigator of Central India Eye Study. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Parul, and thank you, Dr. Surinder, for having me here. And I expect that all of you are able to see my slides now.
Yes, we can see you now.
Okay, that's terrific.
We were missing you earlier.
Yes, I missed the good talks, but there was an internet problem, and I apologize. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the importance of compliance in glaucoma therapy. And also intertwined with it is the non-compliance index and its relevance in glaucoma management. So compliance and adherence are interchangeable terms. Compliance has been defined as the extent to which patients' behaviors corresponds with physician's recommendation. And persistence is the total time for which the patient takes the medications. As a prelude to the difficulties that plague glaucoma management, adherence, as an example, adherence to tamoxifen decreases to roughly about 50% in 2 years in those who have undergone a mastectomy. And that tells you the challenges of compliance. And a compliance of 80% or more is considered acceptable. So as glaucoma specialists, if we accept that, then we would often wonder whether that is appropriate actually. The prevalence of glaucoma in India is calculated at about 11.7 million. Across the world, it is expected to have crossed 60 million. And the commonest means of treating glaucoma is through the use of eye drops. Eye drops are used many millions of times a day, and glaucoma medications also account for a major spend for the patient and a major earn for the corporates. Non-compliance in the use of drops is an important cause of concern in long-term therapy for glaucoma. And it was the purpose to study the pattern and prevalence of non-compliance in glaucoma subjects and to understand its correlations with other ocular and systemic parameters. So we included, it's a small study, we included about 23 subjects with a mean age of 56 years. 21 subjects had primary open-angle glaucoma, 1 PACG and 1 PXF, and 11 subjects had undergone previous glaucoma surgery. All subjects underwent an ophthalmic examination, and the non-compliance index, which was devised here, was determined based on a non-compliance history for the last 90 days. And the number of non-compliant days was divided by 90 and multiplied by 100 to get the non-compliance index. So if there was a patient that missed doses, 1 or more doses, drops on 3 days, then 3 by 90 into 100 would give you a non-compliance index of 3.33. So the lower non-compliance index, the more compliant the patient, and the higher the non-compliance index, the more non-compliant actually. So this was the mean vision, the mean sensitivity, the mean defect. And the retinal nerve fiber layer global thickness was 56.29. And the mean non-compliance index was surprisingly just 5.7 actually, plus minus 8.28 actually, and it ranged up to 33, the non-compliance index. So this gives you an idea of the medication that our patients were using. And although it's a small study, we just thought, let's just find out what non-compliance index correlates to. And higher non-compliance index correlated to a lower vision. And it also correlated to an increasingly abnormal technique of drop installation. And it also surprisingly correlated with greater retinal nerve fiber layer loss in these patients, but there was no correlation with age, gender, weight, height, vision, glaucoma surgery, total number of drops used, mean sensitivity, mean defect, or with touching the nozzle of the bottle. So this is an example of a lady who had primary open-angle glaucoma, and the non-compliance index was rather high in her, up to 33%, and the patient was using a combination of drops actually. And so there were 14 parameters for eye drop, assessing the eye drop installation technique, and we categorized them as category 1, 2, 3, and 4, depending on how many of those parameters were abnormal actually. So the abnormal parameters were a score. So if there was 6 abnormal parameters, it fell in category 3, that is 6 to 10 abnormal parameters in putting the eye drops. So this lady had not washed her hands, instilled more than 1 drop at a time. The bottle nozzle touched the eyelashes. The eyes, she did not close for roughly about 2 minutes. She squeezed her eyes also tremendously while putting the drops, and the nasolacrimal passage was not pressed actually. So this gives an idea as to what are the challenges. There is something that in our mind we consider or we define to be an ideal, drop installation technique. But that doesn't really take place in real life. And that's what we're really worried about, because glaucoma is a real life disease, and the putting of drops is really not real life actually. So this is another 14-year-old boy. He was diagnosed to have congenital glaucoma, and he's using a combination of prostaglandins and alpha agonists and beta blockers. He needed the help of his parents who didn't wash their hands, and the bottle nozzle touched eyelashes. The nasolacrimal passage was not pressed. So the study showed that the mean non-compliance index in our study was roughly about 5.7. This appears to be ideally an actually acceptable non-compliance index over a period of 90 days. But it's important that teaching the correct technique of drop installation might actually improve compliance, and that drop installation may certainly be a challenge to many elderly subjects. It's also important to note that it correlated with increasing glaucomatous damage, and that somehow the increasing severity of glaucoma in some way was related to an increase in non-compliance. This may also be due to the severity of glaucoma or the loss of confidence associated with knowing that one could possibly lose vision. And also that people may not actually be able to recollect, as Dr. Surinder said, they may actually forget, and also that they may hesitate to inform the doctor. So we know that counseling and educating the patient as much as possible is important actually. So really the question is, what is better, medication or surgery? What is really more relevant today actually? Our normal maximal medical treatment is today 3 or 4 drops, types of medications, knowing that by the time you reach the 3rd drop, the pressure lowering efficacy is already less, and that we are struggling with IRP control. So if someone is on maximal medical therapy, that's roughly 5 drops daily, that's 1,825 times a year. And that's roughly about 18,000 times over 10 years. And so we have to ask, are our expectations unrealistic? How many of our patients can sustain medical therapy over 10 years? The question really is, have we reached a place in time where glaucoma surgery may be considered sufficiently safe to be a real alternative to medical therapy actually? We also need to consider if the quality of life may be better with maximal medical therapy or with surgery. While safety with medical therapy has long been considered to be an important consideration, is it possible that we have made trabeculectomy nearly equally safe and perhaps more effective and more cost effective? These discussions may have become even more important today when quality of life and its economic impact on the patient may significantly be impacted with a particular choice of therapy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Vinay. I think that's a very thought-provoking, I would say, lecture, I would say, on related to compliance. And we know there are many issues. I think we'll just take up the questions and discuss this a little later. Parul, maybe you can invite the next speaker.
Yes. So in the interest of time, we'll move on to the next talk. Next, we have Dr. Faisal Titi. He is a young dynamic glaucomatologist, currently an associate professor at the Advanced Eye Center, PGI, and he will be talking to us about principles of trabeculectomy. Dr. Faisal, please.
Okay, thank you. At the outset, I thank COS, Dr. Chintan ma'am and Dr. Jasprit sir and Professor Pandav for giving an opportunity. After an excellent and highly informative talk by 4 speakers, I am going to a different way, that is the principles of trabeculectomy. Is my screen is visible, ma'am?
Yes, Faisal.
Yes, it is.
Okay. Yeah. So my key points of the talks will be basic principles of trabeculectomy, steps of trabeculectomy, and the basic principles of wound healing and its modulations. So as we know, glaucoma is a chronic progressive optic neuropathy which leads to progressive and irreversible loss of vision. And as of now, the most important modifiable fact is raised intraocular pressures. And most of our treatment are targeting to lower the intraocular pressures. And in most of the cases, the medical management is the first line therapy. And advances in the medical therapy have been significantly lead to a decrease in the glaucoma procedure. However, in advanced stages of glaucoma, we need a consistently low target pressure to preserve the existing visual field, and which may not be possible even with maximum medical therapy. And also, previous speaker, Dr. Nangia, already mentioned about the compliance and adherence of the medical therapy. Poor compliance and adherence is one of the major barriers of the medical therapy in developing countries like India. So, glaucoma surgery have a definite role in the management of glaucoma. So, what are the indications of trabeculectomy? The absolute indications are medically uncontrolled glaucoma, progressively deteriorating field even with medically uncontrolled IOP, drug allergies, and compromised ocular surface, poor compliance, and as a primary therapy treatment in advanced disease requiring very low target IOP, and some relative indications, economic considerations. So the basic principles, as we know, trabeculectomy, that is otherwise called guarded filtration surgery, which was introduced in 1968 by Keynes. After that, there are a lot of modifications have been happened. The trabeculectomy, which involved creating an ostium between the anterior chamber and the subconjunctival space, thus bypassing the diseased trabecular outflow. With modification, even though we have multiple surgical options, still the trabeculectomy is considered as a gold standard procedure. So once you create a fistula, the aqueous will cause an elevation of the subconjunctival tissue and conjunctiva, which is called a bleb. From the bleb, the aqueous may pass into the vascular and perivascular conjunctival tissue, even in tear film, in some lymphatic vessel, and a newly formed aqueous vein or a previously existing aqueous vein. So the patient selection is highly important before you planning the surgery. One should take a detailed history, importantly pertaining to the previous ocular inflammation, infection, previous trauma, any kind of bleeding disorder, or any patient using anticoagulants or antiplatelet. And one should have a good, thorough, complete glaucoma evaluation, and also evaluation of ocular surface and the lid and adnexa to rule out MGD and blepharitis. And the counseling is highly important, but because most of our patients are expecting to get a good vision acuity after surgery, but in reality, one can have a loss of vision acuity after glaucoma. So even a successful glaucoma surgery, and informed consent should be taken at least 72 hours before surgery. So you can have multiple type of anesthesia. General anesthesia is indicated in children's, and if the patient is anxious and the patient is not willing for local anesthesia can be infiltrated by peripulvar or retrobulbar route. Studies have found that both these routes have a can increase the IOP around 10 to 30, 20 millimeter of mercury, even 35 to 40% of cases. So one should keep in mind this increase in IOP after injection of perivalvular anesthesia. To avoid these complications, most of the surgeons now shifting to a combination of topical anesthesia and subtenon anesthesia and intracameral anesthesia. So just to the steps of after an adequate opening of the lid, one should get a good exposure with partial thickness or corneal suture with a Dacron or 5-0 seal, or you can have a superior rectus traction suture also. Superior rectus traction have a disadvantage of hematoma and iatrogenic trauma of the muscle, which can to failure of your blood. After adequate exposure, put a small nick and then inject the BSS to get a hydrodissection, which will create a good plane with less trauma to the surgical site. After getting, then do conjunctive, make a conjunctival flap around 3 to 4 claw cover. Then, as you know, for a wound healing, the first step is the clot formation. So to avoid, one have to avoid the bleeding. So to avoid excessive bleeding, use little gentle cautery. Don't do excessive cautery, which also create ischemia and invite more vascularization. So then make a scleral flap of which technique you want. One can make a triangular or a rectangular flap. Then after making scleral flap, one should apply the mitomycin C for 2 minutes or 4 minutes for 0.2% or 0.4% according to the patient criteria, patients. Then do a copious thorough wash with BSS. Make a gentle paracentesis, allow aqueous to egress, some of the aqueous to egress out, then put 1 or 2 pilocarpine to achieve adequate meiosis. Then make a scleral fistula, and you can use a sponge or a 11 number blade to get a scleral fistula. Then after that, make a PI of which is broader than the scleral fistula. Then remove all the debris from the site of the sclerostomy. Then make the suture, which may be 1 tight suture and 2 releasable suture. There are multiple techniques advised. After releasable suture, just de-epithelize the limbus area, then put a tight 2 wing suture and followed by close the relaxing incision also. So during the end of the surgery, you can have a good, nice elevated blood. So post-operative, it is also equally involved. The successfully done surgery is just a half-done job. One should have a good post-operative care and good nurturing of the blood, may need a blood modulation also. So forget an ideal blood is a low-lying normal with a normal conjunctival vascularity and posteriorly diffusing blood. That is an ideal situation. For an ideal situation, we did no healing at the ostium, underneath the scleral flap and the scleral margin, and we need a partial healing at the subconjunctival space and a complete healing at the wound margin. But in reality, most of the time it won't happen. Sometimes the pressure may be controlled, but there would be a scarring or tenon cyst or thin cystic changes and large tenon cyst also in long-term basis also. In reported that even the qualified success is, long-term qualified success is 57 to 90%, even best hands. So the principles, as you know, the wound healing in glaucoma is different as compared to other wound healing, conjunctival wound healing like pterygium surgery or in a scleral buckle, which is wound healing after glaucoma is more complex and not fully yet understood. So there are multiple factors which hinder regulate the wound healing, like preoperative inflammation due to multiple drug, preoperative anti-glaucoma medications. There are various various and aqueous humor factors secondary aqueous humor like VEGF, TGF beta, TNF alpha, interleukin 8 and 6, and the local injury to the surgical site also. All these create a lot of inflammation That is why the conjunctival wound is glaucoma surgery wound is different from other conjunctival wound. So to modulate the wound, in addition, apart from the MMC and 5FU, people are spacing agent like collagen implant, other anti-VEGF, other agents like anti-VEGF agents like Avastin, or making a deep scleral pocket, or putting an express shunt. All these are not have much satisfactory outcome. There are targeted area also, like people are using tocilizumab, ascorbic acid, recombinant interleukin 22, anti-VEGF, and various platelet-derived growth factor inhibitors and MMP inhibitors, and LOX2 anti-LOX2 monoclonal antibody also, and now drug kinase inhibitors. Some of them are under pipeline also. So in conclusion, glaucoma surgery is indicated in many cases of glaucoma. Trabeculectomy is still the gold standard, though there are multiple other modalities, and all blebs are potential to fail at any point of time. So wound healing mechanism after GFS is still not understood completely. Various modulation have been tried, and some of them are under the pipeline, and there is a large scope of future research in the area of wound healing after glaucoma surgery. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Faisal, for a very succinct talk. I would now like to invite our last speaker, Dr. Shrishti Raj, who is a professor at the Advanced Eye Center at PGI, and he would be talking to us about management of a dysfunctioning bleb. Over to you, Professor Shrishti. Are you there, sir?
Yes, I am here.
Yes, sir. Sorry.
Thank you for the introduction. Good evening. So, can I share my slides?
Yes, please share.
So, my presentation is visible.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Good evening. So, after Faisal has presented trabeculectomy, I will be presenting what are the causes for dysfunctioning bleb and how to manage them. So, frankly speaking, we desired a bleb which is of moderate height and extent with less vascularity and Siddle's negative. But in actual practice, that is not the outcome. So there are a lot of complications associated with TRAB, which may be intraoperative, like hemorrhage or flab-related problems, and many others. And a lot of complications in early post-operative period, hypotony with shallow AC or with deep AC, or elevated IOP with shallow AC or deep AC, hyphema, and many others. Though most of the early complications are transient and they, with time, they get resolved spontaneously, but sometimes we may have to intervene. And latest post-operative complications like bleb leaks, thinning, necrosis, cystic bleb, or dreaded complications like blebitis and infections. So bleb leaks. So early bleb leaks occurring within the first 2 months of the post-operative period. This may be due to the failure of the watertight conjunctival closure or conjunctival buttonholing or shallow AC usually and with positive Siddle's, or late occurring few months or years after the trabeculectomy, or use of the anti-metabolites with thin avascular bleb, or leaks from single or multiple sites. So is MMC still right choice? Because even if in low concentration, it is associated with lots of complications like prolonged wound leaks, hypotony with choroidal effusion, and maculopathy, especially in younger myopes, thin avascular blebs, and bleb-related infections, toxicity, and AC reactions, including corneal endothelial toxicity. So complications can be in early period or late onset complications. So early bleb-related complications like hyphema, bleb leaks, shallow AC, hypotonous maculopathy or serous or hemorrhagic choroidals. So shallow AC with hypotony with low IOP with or without flat AC can lead to iridocorneal touch. But most of the time it is transient and resolves spontaneously within a week or two. And if prolonged, it can lead to corneal decompensation, anterior synecdoche formation, or even cataract. And conjunctival defects, button holding like that, which may be missed during the surgery, they can lead to the complications. So if detected, they can be managed conservatively with pressure patch or bandage, contact lens, or sometimes maybe resuturing is required. So managing low IOP, small leaks can be managed with aqueous presence, pressure bandage, or contact lens, or autologous serum. So a large leak with shallow AC of hypotonous maculopathy needs surgical repair in addition to the conservative management. And this is mostly seen with the use of antimetabolites. Now, early failure may be due to the corkscrewing of the vessels, which indicate the underlying fibrous tissue growth. And this is the time when we should give injection of antimetabolite, that is 5-FU. Sometimes we may encounter a overfiltering bleb, and if not resolved, we may have to apply some conjunctival compression sutures. Now, shallow SC with low IOP, overfiltration, large filtering bleb, or loose scleral flap closure, a use of antimetabolites can reduce the resistance to outflow. So management is AC formation with viscoelastic or BSS, or air injection or gas injection, tapering steroids so that the fibrotic activity is increased. Serous choroidal detachments may lead to hypertony, inflammation, and venous congestion, leading to accumulation of proteins in this suprachoroidal space. And management is cycloplegics and oral and topical steroids. And if not resolved, that we may undertake for surgical drainage. And the size should also be monitored with ultrasonography. Sometimes there may be underfiltration and in early postoperative period. So we can apply bleb massage over the lower lid, or if still high, we can remove the releasable sutures and supplement sometime with antimetabolite injection if there are corkscrew vessels also. Now coming to the late bleb complications, astigmatism, cosmesis, Delrin formation, or SPK's foreign body sensation. These are the these complications minor, can be managed conservatively, but thin bleb or necrosed bleb or cystic bleb or choroidals with hypotonous maculopathy or some dreaded complication like blebitis or black later endophthalmitis needs a real management challenge. So late bleb leaks may occur months or years after surgery, and more so in use of the antimetabolites. The leak may be local or diffuse in nature, and preventive strategies during surgery include avoidance of the thin scleral flaps and adequate titration, that is low concentration of MMC, avoiding excessive exposure to the antimetabolites, and use of aqueous presence and bandage contact lens have been described to manage the late bleb leaks. We can try these also. So this is the scarred bleb where there is no fluid underneath the conjunctiva, and such a bleb is a complete failure and may require retrap. And this is the cystic bleb. The bleb is thin, but on cedars there is no leakage. So these can be, these patients can be kept under observation with a close follow-up, and the patient should be primed about this and may be told that in near future, if the leakage occurs, he may require intervention. So this is sweating bleb where there may be intermittent percolation of the aqueous. And this bleb, thin and sister bleb, thin bleb with perforation and cedral positivity require some sort of intervention in form of conjunctival advancement or some patch graft. So this is thin bleb with shallow AC and Esmer's fold and Cedars positive also require the same treatment. And this is the bleb where the ostium is closed on gonio, and this requires ab interno manipulations to release the entrapped iris at the ostium site. So shallow AC with perforation, sometimes we may encounter that with flat bleb, and this also require the advancement of the conjunctiva or a patch graft. Sometimes we encounter a cystic bleb which may not be fully functional. We can try needling or a limited bleb revision in this case. And because these are the short procedures, and we can discuss with the patient that they may be successful, and if fail, they may require a complete retrap. So this is tenon cyst. We can try because there is sufficient fluid under the conjunctiva, so we can try the needling or blebotomy in such needling or the limited trap in this case. So sometimes the bleb is very ischemic and there are real chances of leaking or perforating features. So these should be kept under close follow-up. So various procedures for thin leaking or necrosed bleb, we can do conjunctival flap advancement or autologous conjunctival graft or pericardial graft or many other grafts. And the real challenge is hypotonic maculopathy. So there is a choroidal wrinkling with tortuous vessels with vision loss, and if untreated can become irreversible. So treatment includes conservative transconjunctival suture of the flap or vision of the bleb and scleral flap. So this is blebitis and bleb-related infection. These requires a serious thought and very aggressive treatment in form of antibiotics, cycloplasics, even topical steroids, and including the swab from the bleb area for sensitivity and culture. And use of antibiotics has shown to be more complications. And even TVT studies shows that the early complications are more with trap, but most of these are transient and self-limited. So at a glance, these are the complications related to the dysfunctioning bleb. So in conclusion, early postoperative period is crucial for recognizing and managing complication to salvage the failing bleb. Most of the early complications are transient and they heal spontaneously. Various parameters according to IBGS should be monitored for a better outcome of the bleb. Late complication may be managed by bandage, contact lens, or conjunctival advancement, or even patch graft. Blebitis and BRE, they are rare but dreaded, and they should be managed aggressively. Thank you. Thank you for the patient.
Thank you, Dr. Srishti. I think we have a couple of minutes for discussion. So are there any questions from the audience? Rajesh, I think any video of anti-metabolite injection doses for failing bleb. I think you haven't included the video, but perhaps sometime later. We have videos, but I think Dr. Srishti has not included. So definitely, maybe in some other occasion. Any other questions? Dr. Vinay, you're there. You're still connected. So I think I'll start with you. I don't know when, if the connection fails, then you will disappear again. So what was this non-compliance index actually? I mean, how do you, useful do you find it, and how do you use it clinically?
You know, we couldn't really figure out what index would be used actually. So this was just an in-house devised this thing. So you can't go back beyond 90 days. That's too much, you know, as it is, people are forgetful, you know. For example, you know, I often joke my memory after 60 years is basically 5 minutes actually. So my patient's memory to last so long. So we said, let's not stretch it too much. Let's just do it for 3 months. but you could do it for the last 1 month, you could do it for the last 2 months, and it could still be applicable depending on, how you want to use it. So, so I think it does give you an idea. I think that the longer the time that you take to assess the non-compliance index, the greater the inaccuracy actually. And the shorter the time that you calculate for the non-compliance index, I think it's likely to be more accurate. The problem, however, is that if you have given an appointment to a patient and the patient knows that he's going to visit you, 1 month later, then, just merely the fact that you're going to visit your doctor makes you more compliant actually. So therefore, we took all these parameters into consideration and said, let's do it 90 days actually.
So was this related to the non-compliance index, basically related to the application of therapy? Just that how they use drops, how they use their medication?
Yes.
Yeah.
It was basically, the non-compliance index was merely just whether they had missed 1 or more drops on how many days. So we counted how many days they were non-compliant. It could be that they were using 3 medications, but they missed out just 1 drop. So that day was considered to be a non-compliant day, because that's the only way that you can make it simple enough to apply it.
So the value we gave was like 0.5%, 0.5, right?
No, 5%, 5 point some percent, plus minus 8 something. And the range was from 0 to 33. Also, remember that, you don't know if the patient has forgotten that he forgot to put the drops in, So you need to take all that into consideration.
So how much should it be? I mean, what is a good index?
I mean, it should, I don't think that, considering everything, I think that if you achieve a point where they do not miss out more than 9 days out of 90 days, that's roughly about 10% actually. Then I think that that's a high expectation, but perhaps that's what you want as a doctor treating your patient, that if it goes beyond that, then, then you don't know whether drops are going in at all actually.
But I suspect most people probably will not, have that kind of an index.
I mean, I agree with you. And that's why I'm saying that, are we unreasonable in expecting so much out of our patients? If you take a 70-year-old who has a little bit arthritis, has difficulty in walking, has got moderate glaucoma in one eye, severe glaucoma in the other eye, suffers from hypertension, and, how do you expect him to reach for his drops in addition to the other medications all the time? And how do you ensure that he's going to put the drops in accurately? And that's why I'm going back in reverse and saying that, if we are expecting too much out of a patient, asking him to use so many medications, considering allergy costs, etc., for so many years and not knowing whether he's compliant, non-compliant, is it then better to consider surgery? Is it then better to concentrate on surgery where you think that, this is not going well, but if the patient used the drops, things would be all right, but it's not going well actually. Maybe switch to surgery a little earlier. Is that justified? Is that sufficiently safe? Are we sufficiently happy doing that to the patient and taking responsibility for the patient rather than leaving responsibility on the patient for using glaucoma drops? So basically that's almost self-management, that you're asking patient to use the drops actually. So I think this is something that perhaps, we might just take another look at actually.
I think that is very, very important. In fact, I think that again comes down to sort of personalizing the therapy for a particular patient. So you have to look into the patient's circumstances, whether it can really comply with your prescription or not. And as you mentioned, that the elderly age group, sometimes they have real difficulties actually, and not one difficulty, but multiple difficulties, which could ultimately result in a under treatment. Which could be to the detriment of from glaucoma point of view. So I think your concern is really, I think, valid, and I'm glad you kind of brought it out because it is well known, but we don't talk about that that often. The other thing is, about the long-term therapy, because glaucoma actually is, several years, you said like 10 years, 20 years, you have to keep on using these medicines. So in the initial phase, one might be compliant, but, the things might change over a period of time. And also the requirement for therapy also changes. Plus you have, complication, other side effects, they also tend to come in to complicate the situation. So I think that actually is an area which is really very important, and we should be thinking about that. Okay, so any other questions from other panelists?
So, sir, for regarding AI, I have just one question. If the cup is eccentrically placed, whether the AI can pick it up or like?
Yeah, that is one of the challenges of glaucoma. Why AI for glaucoma has not been picked up as easily as the diabetic retinopathy project. It's the anomalous cupping, the tilted discs, the peripapillary atrophy that adds to the confusion of algorithms. And this is one of the drawbacks that is there. But even with larger data sets, if you have a big data set with eccentric cups, the machine, the algorithms can be trained for that. But that's why there is a little lag of application of this concept to glaucomatous discs. And that is why the percentage of probability is a little less as compared to, predicting a diabetic retinopathy or a hypertensive retinopathy. So I fully agree. It's the disease which is challenging, and the size of the cup again, that's also making it difficult. So there are too many variables to be addressed, and therefore deep learning with a very large database of even anomalous discs is needed for a better predictive value.
The similar way also, if there is a slight temporal pallor, slight temporal thinning, non-glaucomatous cup, whether it can be misinterpreted as glaucoma also.
No, the machines, they have been color primed. So the contrast that is needed for a healthy rim, several of those parameters have been primed as a code in the algorithms. So that can be picked up. And by visual field effects and by optic discs, there has been a good categorization of discs into glaucomatous or non-glaucomatous. But yes, I agree with you. Yes. Dr. Nishal is there, and I would not like to keep us away from the Dr. A.D. Grover.
Welcome, Dr. Nishal. I think.
Surinder, may I make a comment
Yes.
about AI and glaucoma?
Yes, please.
I think that we are approaching AI in glaucoma the wrong way. Large data sets is not the way to go with glaucoma. There's a paper published in TVST that I was involved with recently called Shape Grammars. We need to look at the blood vessels without looking at the retina or the optic nerve. And if we look at those, if you read that paper, it's called Shape Grammars Written in Blood. It puts down the foundations for detecting disease by looking at vessels only. And we all agree that glaucoma is a vascular problem in the end of the day. There is some lack of oxygen to the optic nerve head and the damage to the axons. So I think that large data sets are not the way to go for AI in glaucoma. We need to look at it completely differently.
Thank you, Nishal. I think that's great. But the problem is that because the circulation to the optic nerve, I don't know whether that will be reflected, how well that would be reflected in the fundus pictures, because it's kind of a little deeper down there.
So we're talking about OCTA.
Yeah.
OCTA, as you know, can give you all the layers. So it's not just the retinal vessels; it's the deeper layers and the deeper plexus.
That's great. I think so we have some hope that the AI will come to our aid, come to the aid of our patients. Basically, I think I have to close this session because I think we have overstressed a little bit. Thank you all very, very much for joining, and thank you, Vinay. Thank you, Parul, for moderating the session, and all the speakers, Sushmita and Faisal, Srishti are there. And thank you, Ken, for your comments. Wonderful to have you with us in glaucoma session as well. And we look forward to your next lecture. So I'll hand over to Dr. who is taking over? Dr.
I'm
Chin-
here, sir. I'm here, sir.
Chintan.
And thank you very much. You're
For you.
very much in time.
Thank you very much.
Yes.